It's a great privilege and pleasure for me to be here, and I would like to thank you very much for the opportunity. As the Chair mentioned, I'm an advisor at the European Political Strategy Center, the European Commission's in-house think tank, but the views expressed here are solely mine and do not necessarily represent those of the Commission. I'm also a recovering academic and teach at Sciences Po, but I will try to keep my remarks as brief as possible, conscious of your many obligations. I would like to focus my remarks on the medium-term challenge posed by Russia to Europe and the wider liberal order, and what strategy the EU and its member states should pursue. But first, let me take a step back and put the EU-Russia relations in the wider geopolitical context. The paradigmatic feature of today's world disorder is increased great power competition. The rivalry between autocracy and democracy, once thought of thing of the past, is back again and reshaping the 21st century's geostrategic landscape after roughly a quarter of a century of great power consensus. If you think about it, indeed, since 1989, relations among Europe, the United States, China, and Russia were not only mostly peaceful and cooperative, but also aimed, at least by Western leaders, at a degree of political economic convergence over time. In particular, Russia was viewed as an emerging democracy and even a potential candidate, if you think about it, potential candidate at the turn of the century for NATO membership. Of course, there were notable exceptions to these halcyon years, such as divisions over NATO's intervention in Kosovo or Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008. But the general sense of convergence enabled significant great power collaboration, with Russia acquiescing to the enlargement of NATO and the EU across Central and Eastern Europe, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, Russia's accession to the Council of Europe, the expansion of G7 to the G8, the accession of Russia to the WTO, the US-Russian New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, an agreement on supply routes into Afghanistan, and Russia's acquiescence in the UN Security Council's authorization of NATO's intervention in Libya. Notwithstanding earlier signs of disagreement, 2014 was a clear turning point. The standoff over Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and destabilization of eastern Ukraine marked a severe breach of the international order. This was subsequently continued in Syria, where Russia's significant intervention with troops and military equipment in 2015 in support of the Assad regime was in direct opposition to European and US objectives to restore stability and facilitate a Syrian-led political process in the war-torn country. Russia's interference in the US and European elections in 2016 and 2017 further exemplified a scale of tension not seen since the end of the Cold War. Now, over the medium term, 2 to 5 years, one of Europe's primary challenges will continue to emanate from Russia. The fallout over Russia's very likely use of a nerve agent in the United Kingdom earlier this year to poison its former spy is only the latest instance in the series of conflicts. Although security challenges are historically created by rising powers, it is Russia's stagnation and the drive to conceal it that, like a supernova, has destabilized the foundations of European security and the liberal order. Russia, notwithstanding its outsized geography and self-image, has been by and large at a standstill in terms of material power over the past 25 years and is likely to continue to remain so. Its population, uniquely for a developed country, has actually shrunk, and its GDP per capita is only marginally higher today than at the end of the Cold War. It has few close allies, and its key institutional initiative in the form of the Eurasian Economic Union has plateaued at best. By all objective measures of material resources, Russia is arguably no longer a great power, but rather a regional power with localized influence. Nonetheless, Russia continues to act as a great power and is perceived as such in some quarters. Russia has been investing in its military, with expenditure growing at 10% annually between 2011 and 2016, and accounting for about 4.3% of Russian GDP in 2017, compared to 3.1% in the US, 1.9% in China, and 1.5% on average in the EU. But this spike in military spending is likely to be unsustainable, and Russia may need to revert to the historical average. Now, one of the key successes of the EU's strategy towards Russia have been sanctions. And if you look at the impact of sanctions over the past 4 years, transatlantic sanctions, both EU, US, Canada, and Japan, have imposed a cost of about 1 to 1.5% of Russia's GDP annually, or over 100 billion euros since 2014. And these sanctions appear to be succeeding in constraining Russia's military spending. Economic pressure against Russia had contributed to decreasing its GDP in 2015 and 16, and forcing it to cut defense spending drastically by 20% in 2017. By contrast, between 2000 and 2014, Russia's military spending nearly tripled, with annualized growth rates of around 8%. Even though the Kremlin has not changed its aggressive stance and the ultimate objective of compelling Russia to end the conflict in Ukraine according to the Minsk agreements has not been achieved, its capacity to inflict damage is today more limited. The Python strategy of squeezing Russia is particularly evident in the increased share of Russia's budget spent on defense, around 11% between 2000 and 2014, and up to between 14 and 15% in 2015 and 16. Now, Russia's role in the world is often destabilizing. In Ukraine, Moscow sought to sow chaos and nip democracy in the bud by seizing Crimea at the barrel of the gun through involvement in eastern Ukraine at a human cost of over 10,000 casualties. Russian dreams of Novorossiya, propagated throughout 2014 and 2015, threatened to further carve up Ukraine. But Russia failed in all of these objectives. Ukraine's government is still in power, and its civil society has shown extraordinary resilience and resolve over the past 4 years. And the Kremlin's fundamental concern, its continued viability next to a democratic Ukraine, has been invalidated. Democrats in Kyiv are no more a threat to Moscow than those in Vilnius, Tallinn, or Riga. In contrast to setbacks in Ukraine, Russia's 2015 intervention in Syria was a success by its own standards. Its tactical demonstrations of force served to bolster Russia's international image as a great power, stabilize its ally, the Assad regime, and destabilize Europe through mass-scale flows of Syrian refugees fleeing Assad's brutality. For the foreseeable future, Russia is likely to continue to act as a spoiler to Europe's and the liberal order's objectives and policies. First in Georgia in 2008 and then in Ukraine in 2014, Russia sought to forestall EU and NATO engagement in the region through the use of force in both countries and by supporting separatist movements. Its most recent national security strategy, published in December 2015, explicitly blamed NATO's expansion as, quote, creating a threat to Russia's national security. It sought to defend, quote, traditional Russian religious and moral values, end quote, against, quote, external expansion of ideologies and values, end quote. And indeed, Russian decision makers nowadays view the EU and NATO as two sides of the same Western coin, and over the long term, seek the evisceration and hollowing out of both institutions. Yet, Russia's limited economic base of only 2% of global GDP, less than South Korea and comparable to Australia, and meager economic performance over the past quarter century, about 0.5% in GDP per capita annual growth, severely constrains its ability to attract new adherents to its model. It's not the Soviet Union. Its sizable military instruments still enables Russia to play the role of a spoiler in destabilizing the liberal order, but given its small scale of material resources, it cannot purport to overturn the order. Instead, Russia will continue to opportunistically exploit strategic openings, whether in Libya, Yemen, Afghanistan, or elsewhere, to destabilize Europe, the West, and the liberal order. President Putin's continuation in office after the March 2018 elections suggests that the Kremlin's policies will persist over the medium term and will require commensurate response on the part of the EU. Let me just finish up with a few notes on the EU's strategy thus far and going forward. The strength of Europe's response has rested on unity internally within the EU and externally with like-minded partners. As Maria mentioned, the EU's Russia strategy is based on 5 principles, which you could sort of summarize as a mixture of firmness and engagement. And the current strategy could be summarized as the following: confront where we must and cooperate where we can. It's going to be a mix of both, confrontation and cooperation, and this approach remains sound. As a sixth guiding principle, one should add close policy coordination with G7 partners, such as the United States, Canada, and Japan. This norm has operated in the background already, but one should not lose sight of its necessity to the success of any strategy toward Russia. Russia's attempts to divide Europe and the transatlantic community have largely failed, and instead had the opposite effect of closing ranks within the West. But transatlantic and European unity on Russia did not happen automatically and should not be presumed as a given. Instead, it needs to be continually maintained and coordinated. Over the medium term, Europe's relations with Russia are likely to remain limited to a small set of core interests, such as counterterrorism, climate change, and nuclear nonproliferation. Ultimately, Russia's revealed foreign policy aims to preserve the existence of the Putin regime from internal opposition and to serve the perceived prestige of acting as a would-be power. Russia's true national interest in reconciling with the West by fundamentally changing its offensive behavior will continue to be elusive as long as this goal cuts against the self-perceived concerns of the Kremlin in remaining in power as an authoritarian regime. But this long-term objective needs to be pursued since there is no real European security for future centuries without Russia. Overall, the EU needs to maintain its resolve and strategic persistence. In this endeavor, its decision-making process, slow, deliberate, consensus-driven, and rules-based, is actually its key competitive advantage. Like a grand flotilla, the EU and its member states take time to establish a particular course of action. But once on it, they stick to it until they reach their objectives, however long it may take and however arduous the journey. Thank you very much again, and I look forward to your questions. 2015 resolution that the Parliament adopted is actually quite good and has held the test of time over the past 3 years. I wouldn't change too much the general thrust of the strategy, which was built early on to stand the test of time. Probably when we were in this dealing with this topic in 2014 and 2015, maybe there was a hope that within a couple of years things would turn and things might improve. But this is really a struggle, a test of wills that will last over a longer period of time. And I think that, if anything, the new resolution should reflect that. The other point I would make is that more importantly than ever, G7 and transatlantic cooperation on Russia should be an affirmative aspect of any strategy of any of the individual countries adopted towards Russia, because individually no one will be able to be successful, but collectively we can prevail. And then finally, the real test case of Europe's and the transatlantic community's Russia strategy will be tested in Ukraine. And so I wouldn't think of Russia and Ukraine as separate topics, but really part and parcel of the same issue. And so if you're thinking about specific policies, economic assistance to Ukraine, rule of law reform, all sorts of advisory assistance to help institutionalize and consolidate the democratic progress that's been made in Ukraine will be part and parcel of an overall Russia strategy. And let me thank you again for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to reading the resolution and the report.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for coming and participating in this discussion. That concludes the public hearing on EU-Russia political relations. There are 2 more agenda items I have to cover quickly. Next meetings will be on 26th of November and 6th of December. And last, any other business? No other business. Have a nice weekend. Enjoy the sunshine. The meeting is adjourned.